So as you have received in the email, today's topic will be 3 chapters, 5, 9, and 11, 3 signs that Jesus does in the Gospel of St. John. Before we get there, just a few words about the Gospel. I already said that the Gospel of St. John was at the same time a text which comes from the Apostle. It is sure that the Apostle John was the father of the text, or at least the very beginning of the text, and then it was for sure elaborated during quite some years. What we know about the text is that it was finished between the years 90 and 100, which means more or less 60 years after Christ's resurrection, which means that very logically and spontaneously the text has a double layer, which I spoke about, the layer of the events which are historical and linked to the moment of Jesus having his public ministry, and at the same time there's another layer which reveals the life of the Christian community. That is the gospel which was written the last out of the 4, so it's the latest, but still within the first century after Christ. So it was a text which was not immediately included into the New Testament. First of all, because it came out, or at least the final text was done a little bit later, and then also because it wasn't immediately spread all over the church, but it was rather present in some churches. But then, little by little, the church accepted the text into the canon of the New Testament. When I say the gospel, of course, we here speak about the Gospel of St. John. At the same time, we could think a little bit broader. When we say gospel, it's, of course, the text of the gospel, which means 4 texts, although we have other gospels which were written. Some are not in the Bible, or the majority of the written gospels are not in the Bible, but we do know them. So speaking about the gospel, we speak about what we would consider a new genre in the writings, which until the gospel didn't exist, very simply because it was something completely new. The way of writing the things, and of course the subject of writing the things. The way of writing the things, which answers to the question, how should I take the text of the gospel and how should I live or pray with it? The gospel, the text of the gospel is meant us to lead into the transformation of which the text speaks about. So it's a testimony, it's a written testimony about Jesus, Jesus's public ministry, and especially his work, which was done in the Paschal mystery, which is the source of a transformation of a human nature. So when reading the text, we basically enter into the very fruit of what we experience as Jesus' redemption for us. The subject of the gospel was, of course, completely new because Jesus only came once. And so the gospels are only those texts about his public life and his paschal ministry. Now, we have at the same time the history. So when we read the gospels, it's always historical events. It's not a story, but it's a document of what has happened. At the same time, Christian community, which writes down the gospel, also has a goal of when writing the text. And the goal is that we who read and listen to the text, we would also make a decision for Jesus, who is the Messiah, who is the Savior. So it's not only I read the historical text about the events linked to Jesus, but it's only also an invitation for me to enter into the very question that Jesus always suggests to the Christian, and that is, do you believe, more or less? I go on to today's topic, and that is John 5, 9, and 11. The reason why I suggest those three basically chapters, although we could take some parts out of that strict subject today into chapter 5, but let's say there's those three chapters very simply because they all are the chapters which speak about the three miracles which Jesus does. What is interesting is that the Gospel of John only has 5 miracles. There's what the Gospel says, the first sign. There's the second sign. Both of them happen in Cana. And both are in the chapter 2, in the very beginning of the text. And then we have those 3 at which we look today, 5, 9, and 11. And those are, other than the first 2, let's say in Cana, they're the only miracles which we can read about in the Gospel of St. John. Now, John doesn't speak about the miracles, but the signs, right? The miracles are rather described as miracles in the other 3 Gospels, whereas John uses another word. Why? Well, precisely because this very goal of the gospel is not to say there was a miracle, there's something unusual, extraordinary which happened, but there's a sign, so it's a historical fact, a miracle. But the miracle becomes a sign, let's say, yeah. And when it becomes a sign, it's a proposal for me as Christian to relate to it and finally to give an answer, right? There's 3. So let's go one by one, very simply. John 5, what happens there is we have a sick man. There's no identity. We don't know his name. We don't know what he's incapable of until he gets healed. We don't know where is he from. Basically, we just know the text says there was a man. It's a little bit unusual because when Jesus makes very close meetings, we always know what is the identity of the one whom Jesus meets. For example, Samaritan woman or Nathanael, and so on. So there's a lot of examples where Jesus has encounters and we know with whom he speaks and so on. But here there's nothing such a thing. The second thing, we have to know that the sign of which John 5 speaks is not just a miracle. So there was somebody, we figure out, who couldn't walk, and then after the miracle being done, he can walk. Jesus says in verse 8, stand up, take your mat, and walk. That's how we get to know basically what's his disease and what is he incapable of. He can't walk. Knowing that within the biblical environment, get up and walk is not just a physical fact, not just the fact that somebody cannot walk, and so he has a problem, a physical problem. It's way more. So, in one word, get up and walk would mean that you have received some of life which you don't have, which you don't possess. Basically, if you can't walk and the Lord tells you, get up and walk, it means that he gives you a new life. Just remember, for example, one quick reminder, there's the prophet, eaten by the fish. And then, he was dead in the body of the fish. And then all of a sudden he finds out that he's at the side of the sea. And that's when he hears, get up and walk, go to Nineveh. Just one example. To say get up and walk is something divine which is going on. That's one thing. So we have an unidentified man. We have somebody who's not capable of living, who cannot participate at life. because if you can't walk, you can't go to the temple. If you can't go to the temple, you can't worship. If you can't worship, you're not a part of the society. If you're not a part of the society, you can't survive, right? So there's no life for you. And so get up and walk means that you receive something that you don't possess at all in the first place. And then we have, I would say, an aspect which is underlined even more than the miracle itself, and it's the Sabbath day. It's Saturday, as we would translate it into English. So Sabbath, which comes from Hebrew and literally means the day of the rest, translates into Saturday, which is not the Hebrew root, but that's not important. So in English, we speak about Saturday. It's very present, this whole story about, it was Saturday and this is what is going on. And that was a huge problem. Of course, it all gives us a framework of the Saturday, the day of the rest, as we call it. And we know more or less the content of that day because we read the first book of the Bible, Genesis, where we have narrative of the creation of the world, and then the seventh day, God rested. And therefore, we call that day the day of the rest because God himself rested after his work. A very important theological concept which translates into religious practice in Israel. You should know that if you read a little bit of the gospel. So Sabbath is a very important thing, and it was a source of big conflicts between the Jews or the Pharisees and Jesus and his disciples. The question would be, what's the goal of the Sabbath day? Basically, the goal is that you don't do anything so that you would experience that everything comes from God, right? So you work for 6 days, you take care of your life, and you give yourself everything that is needed for you to live. And then the seventh day, you don't do anything, you don't move, so that you would experience that the real life is given to you by the Lord himself. And that's when you go to the temple to worship the Lord. On that day, you go to the temple and you worship the Lord. You live a liturgical life of the family of God's children. Now, if you can't walk, you can do that because you can't go there. So you're not a member of the family, which is a problem. So if we have the healing, let's say we have an unidentified man, we have him who cannot walk, and we have the Sabbath. So that's enough elements to say, well, it is not just a simple miracle, it's a sign. What does it tell us? Or where to does this sign invite us? Me, for example. If you are unable to walk and unable to participate at the usual life of the community, and then if you receive the healing from that on a Sabbath, on a day of the rest, it means that you are giving a completely new life which you could not have before because God intervened into your life, in your life. And the intervention is Jesus' question, do you want to be healed? As we read in the chapter. It's not just a touching thing. Jesus comes there and kind of he sees, oh my God, we have a problem, let's help him. Yeah, it's also the question of the compassion, but not only, because that question basically tells us that there's an important initiative from God's side, which steps into the life of somebody who is, well, kicked out of the whole life. So he cannot have anything in this life. So if that person is healed, it means that God grants him a completely new life, which he didn't know before. And then to conclude this chapter, if we have just a man, just somebody who is mentioned, but we don't know his identity. Well, that's foundation, strong enough for us to say, well, he is speaking about a human. He's speaking about every single man, let's say, every one of us. So every one of us can be in a situation where you're not capable of entering into the fullness of life. Whereas if Jesus comes to you and he asks you, do you want to be healed? Do you want to be let in to the life? Then the result is there, the fruit is there. Now, what is a very interesting question? If I go on a little bit, we have 2 chapters, 5 and 9, and it's the question of the sin. In chapter 5, with this man being healed from not being able to walk, what he is told is, verse 14, do not sin anymore so that anything worse happens to you. The question, what's the link between the sin and the consequence of the sin? Well, one would think, what's the punishment for the sin? Whereas in the chapter 9, we have in the very beginning, verse 2 and 3, the question coming from the disciples. They say, Rabbi, teacher, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. I'll come back to this question, the relationship between the sin and the consequence. But if we just do the final step in the chapter 5, then the question is, what is worse? What could be worse? Right? Jesus says, do not sin anymore so that anything worse happens to you. What's worse? So what can be worse than not being able to participate, being a man, first of all, being a human being, but not being able to participate in life, whatever kind of, right? Social, material, and of course, spiritual. So what could be worse? Well, Jesus says it's a statement. So if you sin, if you continue to sin, if you live in sin, there's something worse which can happen to you. So there's just one worse thing which we could think about, and that is, well, the eternal life of a human being not being able to participate in the fullness of life, right? So in one word, what's the consequence of sin? Well, eternal life without God, being far from God for eternity. If it's the consequence of sin, it's the consequence of the sin and not God's will, right? God so much loved the world so that no one would lose eternal life. I kind of quote John 3:16. But if one chooses to sin, then there's a consequence to that, which is not according to the will of the Lord, but according to the sin itself, the nature of the sin. And that is, well, there's no explicit answer in the text, but we could conclude, or let's say with the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we could conclude, yes, the consequence of the sin, life of the sin, is eternal damnation, which is the result, the fruit of one's free choice. I go on. So we come to the chapter 9. We again have a sign, just as we have a sign in the chapter 5. So an interesting exercise might be to kind of compare the two signs, because there's something to be compared, right? So there are similar points. There's also differences. What happens, who is there, what are they talking about, and so on. From the perspective of the narrative, a very interesting path, which we could also compare within the chapter. There's one path, and that is the path of the one who received the healing. So he was blind, he receives the sight. He makes a path, and the path leads him towards recognizing Jesus as the Son of God, real divine revelation. But the other path within the same chapter is the ones of the Jews, and those do exactly the opposite path, and that is to acknowledge less and less the possibility of Jesus being the revelation of God. It's a very interesting narrative structure which you can follow through the text. And then, of course, this is a very typical example of how the Christians put their, let's say, spiritual life into the narrative of the gospel, because we also have our spiritual life, our spiritual path, and desire which we have is that we would do exactly the path which the healed blind man does, and that is to go from something that I received from God to the fact of kneeling down and recognizing him, saying, I believe, and saying, you are the Son of God. Now, I come back to the question of the sin and its consequences, because chapter 9 opens another aspect, and one would think, aren't chapters 5 and 9 opposite? Don't they have a message which is not which is difficult to put together, because one chapter says this and the other chapter says that. Chapter 5 says, do not sin anymore, so that anything worse happens to you. So there is a certain consequence to the sin, whereas chapter 9, in the very beginning, through the mouths of the disciples, Jesus says, nobody sinned, because that's not the story, that's not the point, but the point is that you see the works of God. Now, what we have here is the opposition between the two there's no opposition, because the questions are different, right? The first question is, what's the eternal consequence of the sin? Whereas the second question is, why is there suffering? Now, what we have behind is a very clear vision, which was very present in Israel, which is, let's say, seen in the Bible, the biblical texts. And that is the vision of what we call retribution. Retribution. What is it? Well, the theory of retribution is that if you're doing good, God will give you happiness and welfare. Whereas if you sin, God, or let's say, it will result into punishment of any kind, right? So the goods have good consequences. The bad guys have bad consequences. Retribution. So you get the consequences of what you do. Spiritually speaking, this is very present in people's minds and in people's hearts and in people's beliefs, right? Very often people think, I'm going to be good so that the good consequences come to me. I shouldn't be bad because I'm afraid of bad consequences. Now, when somebody experiences something bad, why does it happen? And that's precisely what the disciples asked Jesus. So this man who was blind, who sinned? So who did the sin, the bad thing, so that he has to live with the consequence? And Jesus says it's a wrong theory. The theory of retribution is false. Well, we have a biblical proof of that, and that is the book of Job. The whole book is about that question, right? The book of Job is why some people have to accept the suffering, right? Where does it come from? The book of Job gives an answer, and the answer is, it is not that the good people have only blessings and welfare, and the bad guys have to suffer because of their sins. To read very quickly, you have to go to Job 42, right? That's the very end of the book, where God said to three friends, you were wrong thinking that the theory of the retribution works. So you were wrong. That was a bad thing that you did. The right thing is that Job was right. He, in the silence of his being, accepted God's will, whatever happens. There's a question of the mud in the chapter 9, right? Why? It's kind of weird, right? Jesus spits on the floor, makes mud, and puts it in the eyes of the poor man. That is a question. Why does he do that? What does the mud mean, and what does the washing of the mud on the eyes mean? So there were, in the tradition of the church, there were kind of two possibilities of how could we read that. The mud would be, thinking about the first creation, the second creation which Jesus makes. The first Adam was made from the dust of the earth, and then the second new man, the blind man, was made new. He was given new life through the mud. Okay, yeah. Second possibility is that he had to go wash his eyes. So of course we think about the baptism of which I spoke about. It's very present, chapter 2, chapter 3. And then here we also have washing in the water. So for the Christian community, of course, it's the question of the baptism. It's not false. It can be a good type of reading, but I'll just mention it and not much more. And then we come to the chapter 11, of which I'm not going to say much, not that much, just that it's the last sign and it's the explicit sign. So there's identity of all the people. So there's no, man, but there's a name to the man, there's a family, there's a very precise situation, which is anyway very typical for John. And there's very concrete words. For example, verse 4, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Of course, the illness of Lazarus was for the death. He died. Of course, he was made alive again, but ultimately he died still. So we cannot fully understand those words in any other way than to say the illness is not when I'm sick, when I feel bad or something, but the illness should be understood as the condition of a human being. So Jesus says, this condition of the human being is not meant to lead to the death, because there's a resurrection as the first of the body of the dead, as the first fruit of his mission. And that's the last sign of his public ministry, and that's the last act of his public ministry, because from then on he only speaks to his disciples and he only stays with them. So the first thing which follows the resurrection of the Lazarus is his crucifixion and the resurrection. That's the next step. So here we have, very importantly, the announcement, so to say. And then the other word, which is very important, I would say, or very explicit, super explicit, verse says 25-26, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. And then the question, do you believe this? Right? So no need to explain, but just to say once more, that's why we have the gospel, so that the sign would also be a question for me when I read this. And this very particular sign of resurrection of Lazarus is not just a miracle, and especially not just a miracle, but an introduction to the very mystery of the Christian faith, which is the resurrection.